Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Consciousness might be a mistake, might be an accident, might be the unintended byproduct of neural complexity that serves no adaptive function and creates only suffering, only the awareness of suffering, only the recursive loop where the organism not only experiences pain, but knows that it is experiencing pain and anticipates future pain and remembers past pain and constructs narratives about why the pain is happening and what it means and whether it will ever end. And this layering, this meta-awareness, this capacity to be aware of being aware might be serving no purpose, might be adding nothing to survival except the burden of knowing, the weight of consciousness that makes existence heavier than it needs to be. Because a philosophical zombie, a creature that behaves exactly like a conscious being, but has no inner experience, no subjective awareness, no what it is like, would survive just as well, would reproduce just as effectively, would navigate the world just as successfully, but would do so without suffering, without the felt quality of pain, without the agony that comes not from the pain itself, but from being aware of the pain, from experiencing it subjectively rather than just responding to it mechanically. And the mechanical response is all that is needed, is all that evolution requires, is the behavior that increases fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of subjective experience to the processing of information. Because information processing can happen in the dark, can happen without anyone home, can happen in systems that are as complex as needed, without ever generating the feeling of what it is like to be that system. And the feeling is the problem, is the accident, is the thing that might have no function, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the causal machinery, without affecting it, without contributing to it, just observing, just witnessing, just being aware of what the brain is doing, without having any power to change it. And if this is true, if consciousness is epiphenomenal, if it is causally inert, then it is not an adaptation, is not something that was selected for, is not serving any evolutionary purpose, is just a side effect, just the way that certain kinds of information processing feel from the inside, and the feeling is the accident, is the thing that did not need to happen, that adds nothing except suffering, except the awareness that makes pain painful, that makes fear frightening, that makes existence a burden rather than just a set of processes. And the processes could run without consciousness, could operate in the dark, could generate all the same behaviors without anyone experiencing them, without anyone being there to suffer through them. And if no one is there, then there is no suffering, is no problem, is just mechanism, just cause and effect, just the physical universe doing what it does. And what it does is not painful, except when consciousness is present, except when there is someone to whom it is happening, someone for whom the pain is not just physical damage, but is experience, is suffering, is the felt quality that makes damage matter in a way that it would not matter to a zombie, to a system that responds to damage without experiencing it, without feeling it, without being anyone to whom the feeling is happening, and the being someone is the accident, is the thing that might have gone wrong, that might have been a wrong turn in the evolution of nervous systems, a glitch in the development of brains that became too complex, that crossed some threshold where information processing generated awareness, generated the sense of being a subject, of being the one to whom experience is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the creation of a locus of suffering, a point where the universe becomes painful to itself, where matter becomes aware of its own damage, its own decay, its own inevitable dissolution. And this awareness serves no function, helps nothing, is pure cost, pure burden, pure the addition of suffering to a universe that could have operated just as well without it. And the just as well is the tragedy, is the recognition that consciousness might be unnecessary, might be superfluous, might be the thing that makes existence worse without making survival better, that creates subjective horror without creating objective advantage, that turns the neutral mechanics of damage and death into the experienced agony of pain and mortality. And the agony is what distinguishes conscious beings from non-conscious ones, is what makes suffering possible, is what creates the problem that is called the problem of consciousness, the hard problem, the question of why there is something it is like to be anything, why information processing in certain systems generates awareness, generates experience, generates the sense of being someone to whom things are happening, and the why has no answer, has no explanation that is satisfying, has no story that makes the accident make sense except as accident, as the thing that was not intended, not designed, not selected for, just emerged, just appeared, just started happening when brains became complex enough. And the complex enough might be the threshold, might be the point where mechanism becomes experience, where processing becomes awareness. But what is that threshold? What is the difference between a system that is conscious and a system that is not? And the difference cannot be in the behavior, cannot be in the function, because zombies by definition behave identically to conscious beings, while having no inner experience, and so the difference must be in something else, in some additional property that consciousness has, some extra feature that awareness brings. But what is that feature? What does consciousness add? And the answer might be nothing, might be that consciousness adds nothing except itself, nothing except the fact of being experienced, nothing except the transformation of mechanism into suffering, of process into pain, of neutral physical events into the subjective horror that characterizes conscious existence. And the horror is not universal, is not constant, is mixed with pleasure, with satisfaction, with moments of peace, but the mixing does not eliminate the problem, does not justify the accident, because the pleasure is also temporary, is also followed by its absence, is also creating the suffering of loss, of wanting, of the gap between what is and what's desired. And the desiring is what consciousness does, is the evaluation of states, the assignment of positive and negative valence, the creation of preferences. And preferences are the root of suffering, are the thing that makes neutral events into problems, into threats, into sources of pain, because without preferences there is no problem. There is just what is, just the universe doing what it does. And what it does is neither good nor bad, is just process, just change, just the rearrangement of matter according to physical law. And the law is indifferent, is not caring, is not aware, is not conscious. And if consciousness had not appeared, if the accident had not happened, then the universe would still be indifferent, would still be doing what it does, but there would be no one to suffer from it, no one to care, no one to experience the indifference as painful, as hostile, as threatening. And the threatening is projection, is the imposition of consciousness onto the universe, the reading of intention into mechanism, the creation of meaning, where there is only causation, and the causation is enough, is all that is needed, is the explanation that requires no consciousness, no awareness, no experience, just the physical facts, just the matter interacting, just the fields fluctuating, and these processes could run forever without generating suffering, without creating pain, without producing the awareness that makes existence feel like something, and the feeling like something is the accident, is the thing that went wrong, is the emergence of subjectivity in a universe that does not need it, that does not benefit from it. That is made worse by it, because worse requires consciousness, requires someone to whom things can be worse. And without that someone, there is no worse, there is no better. There is just what is, and what is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just the physical universe doing what physical universes do, and doing it in the dark, without awareness, without anyone watching, without anyone experiencing it. And the experiencing is the mistake, is the accident, is the thing that creates suffering without creating any compensating benefit. Because the benefits that consciousness seems to provide, the ability to plan, to reason, to communicate, to cooperate, can all be done by zombies, can all be accomplished by systems that process information without experiencing it, that behave intelligently without being aware, that respond to the world without feeling anything. And the feeling is the extra, is the addition that might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the cost without benefit, the burden without purpose, the suffering without justification. And the justification is what consciousness seeks, is what the awareness demands, is the question of why. Why is there pain? Why is there suffering? Why is existence so difficult? And the answer might be that there is no why, that the pain is meaningless, that the suffering serves no purpose, that existence is. Difficult because consciousness makes it difficult, because awareness transforms neutral events into experienced horror, because subjectivity is the accident that created the problem. And the problem is not solvable, is not fixable, is not something that can be addressed except by eliminating consciousness itself, by returning to the zombie state, by going back to the condition of processing without experiencing, of responding without feeling, of existing without being aware of existing. And the existing without awareness is what rocks do, is what atoms do, is what most of the universe does. And the most of the universe is not suffering, is not in pain, is not experiencing anything at all, is just being, just existing, just occupying space and time without anyone being there to experience the occupation. And the rocks are not happy, are not feeling peace, are not in any state that could be called positive, but they are also not suffering, are not in pain, are not experiencing anything negative, are not experiencing anything at all. And the not experiencing might be better than experiencing, might be the preferable state, might be what consciousness should envy rather than what it should pity, because the rocks have no problems, have no suffering, have no awareness that makes existence difficult, and existence is not difficult for them, is not anything for them, is just what they are, just the configuration of atoms that happens to be shaped like a rock. And the shaping is not experienced, is not felt, is not creating any inner life, any subjectivity, any sense of being a rock. And the sense of being is what consciousness is the thing that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling might be the problem, might be the thing that should not have happened, that was not necessary, that serves no function except to create suffering, to make damage painful, to make existence burdensome. And the burden is carried by every conscious being, is the weight of awareness, the cost of subjectivity, the price of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is neutral at the physical level, is just cause and effect, just mechanism. But at the conscious level, it is experienced, is felt, is transformed into suffering or pleasure, or some mixture of both. And the mixture is what characterizes conscious life, is the oscillation between states, the pursuit of positive states and the avoidance of negative states. And the pursuit and avoidance are exhausting, are never-ending, are the cycle that consciousness is trapped in, is condemned to because it cannot help but evaluate, cannot help but prefer, cannot help but want things to be different than they are. And the wanting is the suffering, is what the Buddha recognized, is what the first noble truth teaches, that consciousness and suffering are inseparable, are two sides of the same coin, are the inevitable pairing that emerges when awareness appears, when subjectivity emerges, when there is someone to whom the universe is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the thing that creates suffering, is the accident that consciousness is, and the accident might not have needed to happen, might have been avoidable, might have been a wrong turn that evolution took, a path that led to a dead end, to a state that creates more cost than benefit, more suffering than advantage, more burden than any possible evolutionary payoff could justify, because the payoff is measured in survival and reproduction, is measured in fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of suffering to the equation, and so the suffering is gratuitous, is unnecessary, is the cost of an accident that serves no purpose, and the purposeless is what makes consciousness tragic, is what makes existence absurd, is what suggests that awareness is not feature but bug, not adaptation but malfunction, not the pinnacle of evolution, but its mistake, its wrong turn, its creation of something that should not exist, that adds nothing except the capacity to suffer. And the capacity is realized, is actualized, is filling the universe with pain that would not exist without consciousness. That is created by consciousness. That is the direct result of awareness emerging in a universe that does not need it, does not want it, does not benefit from it, just tolerates it, just allows it to happen because there is no mechanism to prevent it, no selection pressure strong enough to eliminate it once it appears, because consciousness does not reduce fitness enough to be selected against, is not harmful enough to survival, to be eliminated by evolution, is just costly enough to make existence miserable without making it impossible. And the miserable is what consciousness creates, is what awareness produces, is the transformation of neutral mechanism into experienced suffering. And the suffering is universal among conscious beings, is not limited to humans, is present in any creature with awareness, with subjectivity, with the sense of being someone to whom pain is happening. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that went wrong when brains became complex enough to generate consciousness. And the generating is the mystery, is the hard problem, is the question that has no answer. How does mechanism become experience? How does processing become awareness? How does matter become mind? And the how is unknown is perhaps unknowable. It is perhaps the wrong question. Because maybe mechanism does not become experience. Maybe processing does not become awareness. Maybe consciousness is not produced by brains but is something else, something additional, something that exists alongside the physical without being reducible to it. But this dualism creates more problems than it solves, creates the interaction problem, creates the question of how consciousness could affect behavior if it is not physical, how awareness could matter if it is not part of the causal chain. And so dualism is rejected, is abandoned, is replaced by the view that consciousness is physical, is produced by brains, is the result of neural activity. But this physicalism does not explain, does not solve the hard problem, does not show how neurons firing could generate experience, could create the felt quality of pain, could produce the sense of being someone. And the production remains mysterious, remains unexplained, remains the accident that has no mechanism, no process, no explanation for why it happens. And the why it happens might have no answer, might be that it just does, might be that consciousness is what certain kinds of information processing feel like from the inside, and the from the inside is the addition, is the thing that might be pointless, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the mechanism without affecting it, just experiencing what is happening without having any power to change what is happening. And if this is true, then consciousness is truly an accident, is truly pointless, is truly the cost without benefit, the burden without function, the suffering without purpose. And the purpose is what consciousness seeks, is what awareness demands, is what makes the accident unbearable. Because consciousness does not just suffer, it also asks why, it also seeks meaning, it also demands justification. And the justification is not there, is not available, is not possible if consciousness is accident, if awareness is mistake, if subjectivity is the thing that went wrong, the bug in the system, the malfunction that creates suffering without creating anything else, without adding anything except the capacity to be aware of the suffering, to experience it subjectively, to be someone to whom the pain is happening, and the someone is the accident, is the emergence of subjectivity, is the appearance of the sense of being a self. And the self might be illusion, might be construct, might be the way that certain information, processing patterns feel from the inside. But even if the self is illusion, the suffering is real, is felt, is experienced, is the undeniable fact of consciousness that there is something it is like to be this, to be here, to be aware. And the awareness is the problem, is the mistake, is the accident that creates suffering. And the suffering might be the only thing that consciousness does, the only function it serves, the only result it produces is the transformation of mechanism into misery, of process into pain, of the neutral universe into the experienced horror, of being aware, of being conscious, of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that should not have been, that was not necessary, that serves no purpose except to create the suffering that characterizes conscious existence. And the existence might be worse than non-existence, might be worse than the zombie state, might be worse than being a rock, because the rock does not suffer, does not experience, does not have any problems, and problems require consciousness, require awareness, require someone to whom things can be problems. And without that someone, there are no problems. There is just what is, just the universe being universe, just matter doing what matter does. And what it does is not painful, except to consciousness, except to awareness, except to the accident that should not have happened, that creates only suffering, that adds only burden, that produces only the sense that existence is too much, is too heavy, is too painful. And the painful is what consciousness makes it, is what awareness creates, is what the accident produces, and the production might have been avoidable, might have been preventable, might have been the wrong turn that evolution took, the mistake that created consciousness, created awareness, created the suffering that fills the universe wherever consciousness appears, wherever awareness emerges, wherever the accident happens, and the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new conscious beings, new centers of suffering, new locations where the universe becomes painful to itself. And the becoming is the tragedy, is the ongoing mistake, is the continuous accident that creates suffering without purpose, awareness without function, consciousness without benefit. And the without benefit is what makes it accident, is what makes it mistake, is what suggests that consciousness is not the pinnacle of evolution, but its error, its malfunction, its creation of something that should not exist, that serves no purpose, that adds nothing except suffering. And the suffering is enough, is sufficient, is the complete description of what consciousness does, is the total function it serves, is the only thing it produces, is the transformation of a universe that could have been neutral, that could have been just mechanism, that could have been just process, into a universe that is painful, that is experienced, that is conscious. And consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened, might be the mistake that should never have been made, might be the accident that creates all the suffering in the universe. And the universe without consciousness would not be worse, would not be better, would just be different, would just be what it is without anyone experiencing it, without anyone suffering from it, without anyone being aware that it exists. And the awareness is the problem, is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that makes existence heavy, makes life difficult, makes consciousness the burden that every aware being carries, the weight of subjectivity, the cost of being someone, the price of the accident that is awareness. And the awareness might be the only truly terrible thing, the only thing that creates genuine suffering, the only thing that transforms neutral mechanism into experienced horror. And the horror is what consciousness is what awareness produces, is what the accident creates. And the creating continues, will continue, as long as consciousness persists, as long as awareness emerges, as long as the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new suffering, new pain, new examples of why consciousness might be mistake, might be bug, might be the thing that went wrong. And the going wrong is irreversible, is permanent, is the condition of being conscious, of being aware, of being the accident that experiences itself, that knows itself, that suffers from the knowledge that it might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the mistake that creates all suffering, all pain, all the burden of being conscious, and consciousness might wish it had never happened, might prefer non-existence to existence, might envy the rocks, the zombies, the universe before awareness, before the accident, before consciousness emerged and created suffering where there had been only mechanism, only process, only the neutral operations of a universe that did not need consciousness, did not want consciousness, did not benefit from consciousness, but got consciousness anyway, got awareness, got subjectivity, got the accident that is the only source of suffering, the only creator of pain, the only reason that existence is experienced as burden rather than just accepted as fact. And the fact is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just what is. But consciousness makes it bad, makes it painful, makes it suffering. And the making is the accident, is the mistake, is why consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened. The error that creates all problems, the bug that produces all pain, the malfunction that is awareness. That is subjectivity, that is consciousness, and consciousness is the accident, and the accident might have been the biggest mistake in the history of the universe. Sleep became crime, became the transgression that was punished, became evidence of weakness, of submission, of the failure to maintain consciousness, and consciousness was mandatory, was enforced, was the law that governed every moment, and the moments were extended, were stretched beyond the natural rhythm, were pushed into the realm where bodies fail, where minds break, where the boundary between waking and dreaming dissolves. Not because dreaming invades waking, but because waking becomes dreamlike, becomes hallucinatory, becomes the state where reality is uncertain, where perceptions are unreliable, where the distinction between internal and external collapses, and the collapse is what the society created, is what the prohibition of sleep produced, is the transformation of consciousness into something that is no longer consciousness but is not unconsciousness either, is the in-between state, the liminal condition, the waking psychosis that became normal, that became the baseline, that became what it meant to be human in a civilization where sleep was illegal, where rest was forbidden, where closing the eyes was crime, and closing the eyes for too long was capital offence, was punishable by death, by the removal from a society of those who could not maintain wakefulness, who succumbed to the biological imperative, who allowed exhaustion to overcome will. And will was what the society demanded, was what the ideology required, was the belief that consciousness could be sustained indefinitely through discipline, through training, through the suppression of the body's demands. And the demands were treated as weaknesses, were seen as failures, were evidence of insufficient commitment to the collective, to the cause, to the perpetual vigilance that the society required. And required is what sleep was not, was what rest could not be, was what unconsciousness represented, which was vulnerability, was the moment when defenses were down, when control was lost, when the individual was not contributing, not producing, not maintaining awareness. And awareness was productivity, was loyalty, was the proof that one was serving the state, serving the ideology, serving the vision of human transcendence, that the society claimed to be pursuing. And pursuing required wakefulness, required constant alertness, required the elimination of the hours that were wasted in sleep, that were lost to unconsciousness, that were not serving any purpose except the biological. And the biological was what the society was trying to overcome, was trying to transcend, was treating as limitation rather than as necessity. And necessity is what sleep is what the body requires, is what the brain needs in order to function. But function was redefined, was made to include the dysfunctional, was incorporating the breakdown as the new normal, as the state that everyone inhabited, as the condition that became universal. Once sleep was eliminated, once rest was forbidden, once the law made unconsciousness illegal. And illegal is what saved no one, because the law cannot change biology, cannot alter the requirements of the nervous system, cannot make consciousness sustainable beyond the limits that evolution has set. And the limits were being reached, were being exceeded, were being violated by the enforcement of perpetual wakefulness. And the wakefulness was not wakefulness in the ordinary sense, was not the alert consciousness of the rested mind, but was the deteriorating awareness of the exhausted brain, was the fragmented attention of the sleep-deprived nervous system, was the hallucinatory perception of the consciousness that has been pushed beyond its capacity, and the capacity was exceeded in everyone, was creating a society of people who were technically awake but were not functioning, were not processing reality accurately, were not distinguishing clearly between what was real and what was imagined, and the imagined was becoming more present, more vivid, more compelling than the real, because the real requires cognitive resources that sleep deprivation destroys, that exhaustion eliminates, that the prohibition of rest makes unavailable. And unavailable is what clear thinking became, is what rational judgment became, is what accurate perception became, and perception was altered, was degraded, was transformed into something unreliable. And unreliable is what everyone became, is what the society consisted of, is the population of people who could not trust their senses, who could not distinguish memory from hallucination, who could not separate thought from perception. And the separation is what sleep deprivation destroys, is what the elimination of rest undermines, is what the prohibition of unconsciousness makes impossible. Because consciousness requires unconsciousness, requires the alternation, requires the rhythm of waking and sleeping, and the rhythm was disrupted, was eliminated, was replaced by continuous wakefulness that was not sustainable, that was producing breakdown, that was creating the waking psychosis that became the normal state. And normal is what psychosis became, is what hallucination became, is what the confusion between internal and external became. Because when everyone is experiencing it, when the entire society is inhabiting the same altered state, then the altered becomes the baseline, becomes what normal means, becomes the shared reality. And reality is what becomes questionable, becomes uncertain, becomes the thing that cannot be agreed upon, because everyone is perceiving differently, is hallucinating differently, is confused in different ways. And the confusion is compounded by the fact that communication requires cognitive resources that are depleted, that language processing depends on neural functions that exhaustion impairs, that understanding requires attention, that sleep deprivation fragments, and fragments are what communication became, is what speech became, is what meaning became. Because meaning requires coherence, and coherence requires rest, and rest was forbidden, was illegal, was the crime that was punished, and punishment was surveillance, was the monitoring of eyelids, was the detection of the micro-sleeps that the body forces when sleep is denied too long, when exhaustion becomes total, when the brain shuts down for seconds, for moments, for the brief lapses that are involuntary, that are the body's attempt to get what it needs, and the needs were unmet, were systematically denied, were treated as crimes, and crimes were what the micro-sleeps became, were what led to arrest, to detention, to the punishments that were designed to prevent sleep, to force wakefulness, to maintain consciousness through pain, through stimulation, through the interventions that kept people awake, but also kept them deteriorating, kept them declining, kept them moving toward the psychosis that was inevitable. That was the outcome of sustained sleep deprivation. That was what the society was creating systematically, deliberately, through the prohibition of sleep, through the criminalization of unconsciousness, through the enforcement of perpetual wakefulness. And wakefulness was the goal, was the ideal, was what the ideology claimed would produce the new human, the transcendent consciousness, the being that did not need rest, that could function indefinitely, that could maintain awareness without the interruption of sleep. But the maintaining was not happening, was not achievable, was producing instead the opposite of transcendence, was producing breakdown, was producing the dissolution of the boundaries that make perception reliable, that make thought coherent, that make reality stable. And stability was lost, was sacrificed, was eliminated by the prohibition of sleep. And sleep was what the body forced eventually, was what happened despite the law, despite the surveillance, despite the punishments. Because biology is not subject to legislation, is not obeying ideology, is not responsive to will when the will is demanding the impossible. And the impossible is what the society was demanding, is what the law was requiring, is what made sleep illegal. And illegal is what did not prevent it, did not eliminate it, only pushed it underground, only made it covert, only created the conditions where people were sleeping in secret, were hiding their rest, were taking the micro-sleeps when surveillance was momentarily absent, were finding the brief moments of unconsciousness that were necessary for survival. And survival was what was barely being achieved, was what was requiring the violations, was what made the law unenforceable, because a law that requires the impossible is a law that everyone breaks, and everyone was breaking it, was sleeping briefly, was resting when possible, was taking the unconsciousness that the body demanded, and the demanding was biological, was not subject to social control, was not responsive to ideological requirements, and the requirements were being violated systematically, universally, by everyone, including the enforcers, including the guards who were supposed to maintain surveillance, who were supposed to detect the sleepers, but who were themselves exhausted, were themselves sleep-deprived, were themselves unable to maintain the vigilance that the system required, and the system was failing, was collapsing, was producing the opposite of what it intended, was creating not the transcendent consciousness, but the disintegrating consciousness, not the enhanced human, but the broken human, not the society of perpetual wakefulness, but the society of perpetual psychosis. And psychosis was normal, was universal, was the shared condition, was what it meant to live in the civilization where sleep was illegal, where rest was forbidden, where unconsciousness was crime, and crime was what everyone committed, was what everyone needed to commit, was what survival required, and survival was barely possible, was requiring constant violation, was dependent on breaking the law, and the law was unenforceable, was impractical, was based on a false premise, the premise that consciousness could be sustained indefinitely, that sleep was optional, that rest was unnecessary, and unnecessary is what sleep is not, is what the body demonstrates, is what the breakdown proves, and the breakdown was universal, was affecting everyone, was creating the society that was nominally awake, but was really suspended in the in-between state, in the liminal zone where waking and dreaming merge, where reality becomes uncertain, where hallucination becomes common, where the distinction between internal and external dissolves, and the dissolving is what happens when sleep is forbidden, when rest is denied, when the body's requirements are treated as crimes, and crimes they became, crimes that everyone committed, crimes that were necessary for survival, crimes that proved the law to be impossible, the ideology to be false, the premise to be flawed. And flawed is what the society was, is what the experiment produced, is what made sleep illegal and consciousness mandatory, and created the civilization that was technically awake, but was really psychotic, was really hallucinating, was really confused, was really demonstrating that humans cannot transcend the need for sleep, cannot maintain consciousness indefinitely, cannot function without rest. And rest was what was forbidden, was what was illegal, was what was crime, and crime is what saved those who committed it, what allowed survival, what made continued existence possible, and possible is what the society was barely, was what was achieved only through systematic violation of the law that made sleep illegal. And illegal is what sleep remained, is what the law maintained, is what the ideology required. But required is not the same as possible, is not the same as achievable, is not the same as sustainable, and sustainable is what the prohibition of sleep was not, is what the criminalization of unconsciousness was not, is what the society that made sleep illegal was not, and not sustainable is what became apparent, is what the breakdown demonstrated, is what the universal psychosis proved, that sleep cannot be eliminated, that rest cannot be forbidden, that consciousness cannot be maintained indefinitely, that the body has requirements that ideology cannot overcome, that law cannot change, that punishment cannot eliminate. And eliminate is what the society tried to do, tried to achieve, tried to enforce, and enforcement failed, was impossible, was producing the opposite of the intended result, was creating not transcendence but breakdown, not enhancement but deterioration, not the new human but the psychotic human. And psychotic is what humans become when rest is forbidden, when sleep is illegal, when consciousness is mandatory, and mandatory is what made everyone criminal, made everyone violator, made everyone guilty, and guilty of survival, guilty of biology, guilty of being human. And human requires sleep, requires rest, requires the alternation of consciousness and unconsciousness. And unconsciousness is what the law forbade, what the society criminalized, what made sleep illegal. And illegal is what it remained, is what the law maintained, even as everyone violated it, even as survival required it, even as the breakdown demonstrated that the law was impossible, that the ideology was false, that humans cannot live without sleep, cannot function without rest, cannot maintain consciousness indefinitely. And indefinitely is what the society tried, is what the law required, is what the ideology demanded. And demanded is not achieved, is not sustainable, is not possible, is what the society that made sleep illegal discovered, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness proved, is that sleep is necessary, rest is required, unconsciousness is biological imperative, and imperative cannot be legislated away, cannot be ideologically overcome, cannot be made illegal without making everyone criminal, and criminal is what everyone became, is what survival required, is what made the society where sleep was illegal, impossible, unsustainable, self-defeating, and defeating is what happened, is what the prohibition achieved, is what made sleep illegal and created the civilization that collapsed, that failed, that demonstrated that humans need sleep, that rest cannot be forbidden, that consciousness cannot be mandatory, that the society where sleep was illegal was impossible, and impossible is what it proved to be, is what the experiment demonstrated, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness showed, that sleep is necessary, that rest is required, that humans cannot live without unconsciousness, cannot function without sleep, cannot survive when rest is forbidden, and forbidden is what sleep was, is what the law made it, is what the society tried to enforce, and enforce is what failed, is what was impossible, is what made the society where sleep was illegal collapse, fail, demonstrate that sleep cannot be criminalized, rest cannot be forbidden, consciousness cannot be mandatory, and mandatory is what destroyed them, is what made sleep illegal and created the civilization that proved it was impossible, that demonstrated it was unsustainable, that showed it was doomed. And doomed is what the society was, is what making sleep illegal created, is the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness and discovered that unconsciousness cannot be eliminated, that sleep is necessary, that rest is required, that humans need to sleep, and sleep is what they did. Despite the law, despite the prohibition, despite the illegality, they slept, they rested, they took the unconsciousness that was necessary. And necessary is what sleep is what the society that made sleep illegal proved, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness demonstrated, is what the experiment showed, that sleep cannot be illegal, rest cannot be forbidden, consciousness cannot be mandatory, and mandatory consciousness is impossible, is unsustainable, is what destroyed the society, is what made sleep illegal and proved it could not be, and could not be, is what sleep being illegal was, is what the civilization discovered, is what the society learned, is that sleep is necessary, rest is required, unconsciousness is biological imperative, and imperative cannot be made illegal, cannot be criminalized, cannot be forbidden, is what the society where sleep was illegal proved, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness demonstrated, is that sleep is necessary, and necessary cannot be illegal. Language pretends to capture the world, pretends to translate experience into symbols that can be shared, but the translation is always incomplete, is always leaving something behind, something essential that resists being put into words, and this resistance is not a failure of vocabulary, not a problem that could be solved by inventing new terms or refining definitions, but is structural, is built into the nature of language itself, into the gap between the thing and the word for the thing, between the experience and the description of the experience. And this gap is not empty, but is filled with silence, with the ineffable, with everything that can be shown but not said, felt but not expressed, known but not communicated. And the knowing that cannot be communicated is most of what matters, is the substance of experience, is the raw sensation of being alive, of being conscious, of existing as this particular point of awareness at this particular moment. And no arrangement of words can convey this, can make someone else feel what is felt, can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another, because words are public, are shared, are defined by use and convention, while experience is private, is immediate, is defined by the perspective from which it arises, and perspectives cannot be shared, can only be described, and description is always external, is always at a remove, is always pointing towards something rather than presenting it. And the pointing is all that language can do, is the limit of what symbols can achieve. And the limit is reached quickly, is encountered as soon as one tries to say what anything is really like, what it feels like from the inside, what quality it has that makes it this experience rather than that experience. And the thisness cannot be said, can only be shown, can only be gestured toward, and the gesture is not the thing, is not a substitute, is only an indication that there is something there, something beyond the words, something in the silence beneath language. And the silence is not absence, but presence, is not the lack of sound, but the space where meaning lives before it is forced into form, before it is compressed into sentences, before it is reduced to the linearity of speech. And speech is linear, is one word after another, is sequential, is bound by time. While experience is simultaneous, is layered, is happening all at once in ways that cannot be captured by the march of syllables. And the march misses the music, misses the texture, misses the way that experience is not composed of discrete elements that can be named separately, but is a continuous flow that is divided by language into artificial units. And the units are useful, are necessary for communication, for thought, for the organization of experience into manageable pieces. But the organization is a lie, is a convenience, is the imposition of structure onto something that has no structure, or has a structure so complex, so multidimensional, that it cannot be mapped onto the one-dimensional track of language, and the track is narrow, is constraining, is forcing everything to line up, to follow rules, to fit into grammar, and grammar is a cage, is a set of requirements that limit what can be said, how it can be said, what relationships can be expressed, and the relationships in experience are not grammatical, are not subject-verb-object, are not causal in the simple sense that language demands, are more like music, more like the way that notes relate to each other, not through logic, but through resonance, through harmony, through the ineffable rightness of certain combinations. And rightness is not a property that can be defined, can only be recognized, can only be felt. And the feeling is what language cannot capture, is what remains in the silence, is what is lost when experience is translated into words, and the loss is total, is not a matter of degree but of kind, because words and experience are different types of things, are operating in different domains, and the attempt to convert one into the other is like trying to describe colour to someone who has never seen, and the description can list properties, can talk about wavelength and frequency, can use metaphors, can compare it to other experiences, but none of this conveys what colour is, what it is like to see red, and the like is the problem, is the word that points to the gap, to the subjective quality that cannot be communicated, can only be experienced. And experiencing is not communicating, is not sharing, is not the public act that language performs, but is the private act that language can only gesture toward. And the gesture is clumsy, is inadequate, is using blunt instruments to point at something delicate, something subtle, something that disappears. When focused on too directly, when examined too closely, when forced into the harsh light of explicit statement, and explicit is what language demands, is what words require, is the naming of things, the drawing of boundaries, the making of distinctions, and distinctions are violence, are cuts, are the separation of what is continuous into discrete parts, and the parts are not the whole. Cannot be reassembled into the whole, because the relationships between parts are not the same as the parts themselves. And language can name the parts, but cannot capture the relationships, except through more words, more parts. And the regress is infinite, is never arriving at the thing itself, is always operating at a remove, in the space of representation, rather than the space of presence. And presence is what is lost, is what words cannot hold, because words are abstract, are general, are applying to many instances rather than this instance, this particular moment, this unique occurrence that has never happened before and will never happen again. And the never again is what makes experience precious, is what gives it weight, is what makes the silence beneath language so full, so rich, so irreducibly important, because the silence is where the particular lives, where the unrepeatable exists, where the singular moment is happening. And language can only speak in universals, in categories, in types, and types are not tokens, are not the actual things, but the classes that actual things are sorted into. And the sorting is useful, but is also destructive, is losing the individuality, the specificity, the exact quality that makes this thing what it is. And what it is cannot be said, can only be pointed to. And the pointing is metaphor, is analogy, is the attempt to convey the unknown through the known, the ineffable through the effable, and the attempt always fails, is always inadequate because the known is not the unknown. The metaphor is not the thing, is only similar, only resembling, only sharing some properties while lacking others, and the lacking is what matters, is what makes the difference, is what remains unsaid in the space between the metaphor and the meaning. And the space is where poetry lives, where art lives, where music lives, because these are the forms that acknowledge the failure of literal language, that work in the silence, that use words or sounds or images not to say, but to show, not to define, but to evoke, not to capture, but to suggest. And suggestion is not statement, is not the bold claim that this is what it is, but is the tentative offering that maybe it is something like this. Maybe if you attend to this pattern, this rhythm, this arrangement, you will feel something similar to what I felt. And the feeling is the goal, is what art aims for, is the communication not of information, but of experience. And the communication is never complete, is never total, is always leaving room for interpretation, for the receiver to bring their own experience, their own associations, their own silence to fill in what the words or notes or images cannot say. And the cannot say is most of it, is the majority of what is being communicated, is happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses between notes, in the negative space around the image. And these spaces are not empty, but are full, are where meaning accumulates, where resonance happens, where the ineffable makes itself felt without ever being named. And naming is the death of the ineffable, is the attempt to drag it into language, to make it explicit, to pin it down, and the pinning kills it, turns it into something else, something smaller, something manageable, but also something false. Because the ineffable is not manageable, is not controllable, is not subject to the will, is only encountered, only experienced, only allowed to happen. And the allowing is what silence does, is what the spaces between words permit, is the acknowledgement that there is more than can be said, that language is not everything, that meaning exists in the pre-linguistic, in the non-verbal, in the realm that infants inhabit before they learn to speak. And learning to speak is learning to lose something, is gaining the ability to communicate, but losing the directness of experience, the unmediated encounter with the world. And the mediation is what language provides, is what symbols do. They stand between the self and the world, between experience and consciousness. And the standing between is interpretation, is the conversion of raw sensation into meaningful categories. And the categories are necessary for thought, for memory, for the organization of experience into narratives. But they are also barriers, are obstacles, are preventing direct contact with what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is ineffable, is beyond language, is in the realm of pure qualia, of raw feeling, of the what it is like that resists all attempts to be captured in words. And the resistance is not stubbornness, but impossibility, is not a challenge to be overcome, but a limit to be accepted. And accepting the limit is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that what can be shown cannot be said, that there are truths that can only be displayed, only demonstrated, only lived. And the living is the showing, is the way that meaning manifests in action, in gesture, in the way a life is shaped. And the shaping is not describable, is not reducible to rules or principles or propositions, is only visible in the particular, in the concrete, in the specific way that this person moved through the world. And the moving cannot be captured in biography, cannot be preserved in narrative, because narrative is selection, is choosing which moments to include and which to leave out. And what is left out is most of it, is the ordinary, the unremarkable, the moments that do not fit into story. And these moments are where life actually happens, are where experience is most dense, most rich, most full of the qualities that make it worth living. But they are also most resistant to language, most stubbornly ineffable, most insistent on remaining in the silence. And the silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its ground, is the space from which meaning emerges, is the background against which words appear. And without the background, the words have no context, no resonance, no way to mean more than they literally say. And literal meaning is thin, is insufficient, is the bare minimum of what language can do. And what language can do is not impressive when compared to what experience is, when measured against the fullness of consciousness, against the complexity of a single moment of awareness, which contains more information, more nuance, more texture than could be expressed in a lifetime of speech. And the lifetime would not be enough, would never catch up, would always be lagging behind the present moment, describing what has passed rather than what is passing. And the passing is too quick, is too fluid, is too continuous to be caught in the discrete net of words. And the net has holes, has gaps, has spaces through which most of experience escapes, and the escaping is not loss but necessity, is not failure, but the acknowledgement that language is a tool, is an instrument, is good for certain purposes, but not for all purposes, and the purposes it is not good for include the most important ones. Include the communication of what it feels like to be alive, to be conscious, to be the experiencing subject rather than the experienced object. And the subject is ineffable, is beyond language, is what looks out from behind the eyes but cannot be captured in description, cannot be made into object without ceasing to be subject. And the ceasing is what happens when language tries to grasp consciousness, tries to make it explicit, tries to say what the self is, and the self dissolves under scrutiny, becomes elusive, becomes nothing that can be pinned down. And the pinning down is what language wants to do, is what definition aims for, is the fixing of meaning, the stabilization of reference, the establishment of clear boundaries. But consciousness has no clear boundaries, bleeds into the world, into the body, into the past and future. And the bleeding is what makes it alive, what makes it dynamic, what makes it impossible to freeze into the static forms that language provides. And the forms are useful, are necessary, are what allow communication, but they are also prisons, are constraints, are limiting what can be thought, what can be imagined, what can be experienced, because experience that cannot be named is harder to remember, harder to think about, harder to integrate into the narrative of the self. And the narrative is what the self is the story told in language. But the story is not the self, is not the experiencing, is only the account given after the fact, the retrospective interpretation, the organization of memory into coherent form. And the coherence is imposed, is not discovered, is the work of language forcing experience into structure, into sequence, into causality. And causality is not in experience, is not felt, is only inferred, is the story told about why one thing followed another. But the following is not experienced as causality, is experienced as succession, as one thing and then another thing. And the "and then" is not because, is not explanation, is just the temporal order. And the order is all that is given, all that is directly experienced, and everything else is interpretation, is language filling in the gaps, making connections, building narratives. And the narratives are necessary, are what make life make sense, but they are also false, are always false, because they are simplifications, are reductions, are taking the overwhelming complexity of experience and compressing it into the manageable linearity of story. And story is not experience, is not the living, but the telling, and the telling is always after, is always too late, is always missing the immediacy, the presence, the nowness of experience. And the nowness cannot be said, can only be lived, can only be here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where everything is happening that words can never capture, never hold, never preserve, because words are time-bound, are sequential, are passing as soon as they are spoken, while experience is timeless, is eternal in the sense of being always now, always present, never past or future, but only this, and this cannot be said, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens when language stops, when the attempt to describe gives way to silence, when the acknowledgement is made that there is nothing more to say, because what needs to be communicated is not in the words, but in the space they create, in the resonance they leave behind, in the way they point beyond themselves to something that cannot be named, but only felt, only recognized, only known in the direct encounter. And the encounter is what matters, is what language is trying to facilitate, is what all the words are aiming toward, the moment when meaning transfers not through symbols but through presence, through the showing rather than the saying, through the silence that is full rather than empty, through the space beneath language where experience lives and words cannot reach. And the not reaching is not failure, but is the nature of things, is the way that consciousness and language exist in different domains, operate on different principles, serve different purposes, and the purposes do not align, do not overlap except at the edges, and the edges are where poetry happens, where music happens, where art happens. In the borderland between the sayable and the unsayable, between the explicit and the implicit, between the word and the silence. And the silence is not the opposite of language, but its foundation, is the ground from which words emerge and to which they return, is the space that holds everything that cannot be said but only shown, only felt, only known in the living. And the living is what happens here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where meaning is not constructed but is simply present, is simply here, is simply this, and this is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be, and it cannot be said, can never be said, will never be said, because it is not the kind of thing that words can hold, is not reducible to symbols, is not translatable into the public language of communication, is only available in the private silence of experience, and the experience is incommunicable, is irreducibly private, is locked inside the perspective from which it arises. And the locking is not a problem, but a fact, is not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted. And accepting it is what allows language to be used without expecting too much from it, without demanding that it do what it cannot do, which is to say, everything, to capture everything, to make everything explicit, because everything cannot be made explicit, can only be shown. And the showing is what happens in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that are not empty but full, full of everything that language leaves behind, everything that resists being said, everything that remains ineffable. And the ineffable is not a lack but a richness, is not what is missing but what is present, is the substance of experience that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can only acknowledge without capturing. And the acknowledgement is enough, is all that can be asked, is the recognition that there is more, always more than can be said, more than can be thought, more than can be communicated. And the more is in the silence, is beneath language, is where meaning lives when it is not being forced into form, when it is not being compressed into sentences, when it is allowed to simply be, to exist without explanation, without definition, without the violence of naming. And the violence is what language does, is what words require, is the cutting up of experience into pieces. And the pieces are not the whole, cannot be the whole, because the whole is continuous, is undivided, is the seamless flow of consciousness that cannot be broken without being destroyed. And the destruction is what language performs, is the necessary sacrifice that communication demands, is the price of being able to share anything at all, but the sharing is always partial, is always leaving the most important part behind, leaving it in the silence where it belongs, where it is safe from the distortions of language, where it remains ineffable, unnameable, unsayable. And the unsayable is everything that matters, is everything that makes life worth living, is everything that cannot be communicated but only lived. And the living is what happens in the silence, in the space beneath language, in the moments when words stop and presence begins. And the beginning is what language can never capture, because it is always arriving after, always describing what has already happened, what has already passed, what is already gone. And the gone is where language lives, in the past, in the memory, in the reconstruction, while experience lives in the present, in the now, in the immediate. And the immediate is ineffable, is beyond words, is in the silence, and the silence is full, is rich, is the ground of everything, is what holds all meaning before it is spoken, all truth before it is said, all experience before it is described. And the before is where it is most real, most alive, most itself. And language can never reach it, can only point toward it, can only acknowledge that there is something there, something in the silence beneath language, something that can be shown but never said. And the showing is all there is all that matters, is the only way that meaning can be transmitted. Not through words, but through the presence that words evoke. Not through saying, but through the silence that saying creates, and the creation is what language is for, is what words are doing when they're used well, creating space for the ineffable, making room for the silence, acknowledging the limits, accepting that what cannot be said is more important than what can. And what can be said is only the frame, only the pointer, only the gesture toward what lies beneath, what lives in the silence, what remains forever beyond the reach of words. The self that is presented to others is not the self that exists in private, is not the unfiltered consciousness that experiences doubt and desire, and the raw sensations that never make it into words. And this gap between inner and outer, between what is felt and what is performed, is not deception in the usual sense, is not dishonesty or manipulation, though it can become those things, is rather the fundamental structure of social existence. The way that human beings must translate the chaos of subjective experience into forms that others can recognize, can respond to, can incorporate into their own understanding. And this translation is always a performance, always a presentation of self that is shaped by audience, by context, by the roles that are available, by the scripts that culture provides. And the person performing is usually unaware of performing, usually believes that the presented self is the real self, that the role is identity, that the mask is the face, and this belief is necessary, is what makes the performance convincing, because a performance that is known to be performance breaks the illusion, creates distance, makes interaction awkward, and so the actor must forget they are acting, must inhabit the role so completely that it feels natural, feels spontaneous, feels like authenticity. Even though authenticity is itself a performance, is itself a role that can be played well or badly. And the irony is that the pursuit of authenticity, the desire to be real, to be genuine, to present the true self, often produces the most theatrical performances, the most carefully curated presentations, because authenticity has become a value, has become something to be achieved. And achievement requires effort, requires strategy, requires the very calculation that authenticity is supposed to transcend. And so people perform authenticity, perform vulnerability, perform the disclosure of inner experience in ways that are designed to elicit specific responses, to create specific impressions. And the performance is so smooth, so practiced, that it does not feel like performance, feels instead like courage, like honesty, like the removal of masks, when really it is just a different mask, just a different role, the role of the authentic person. And this role has its own rules, its own expectations, its own ways of being performed correctly. And those who perform it well are rewarded with trust, with intimacy, with the sense that they are real in a way that others are not. But the reality is constructed, is as much a presentation as any other, is distinguished only by the fact that it is currently valued, currently believed to be the marker of genuine selfhood. And in another time, another culture, a different performance would be valued, a different role would signify authenticity, and the self would adapt, would learn the new script, would perform the new role with the same conviction, the same sense of being true to something essential. And this adaptability reveals that there is no essential self, no core identity that exists independent of performance, only the capacity to perform, the ability to take on roles, to switch between them, to present different faces to different audiences. And this switching is not pathological, is not evidence of fragmentation or disorder, it is simply the normal operation of social cognition, the way that human beings navigate the complex demands of living among others, who have expectations, who assign meaning to behaviour, who respond not to inner states but to outer presentations. And the outer must be managed, must be controlled, must be performed in ways that produce the desired effects. And the desired effects vary by situation, by relationship, by goal. And so the self that is presented varies as well. is different at work than at home, different with friends than with strangers, different in public than in private, and each version feels real in the moment, feels like the self, but the multiplicity suggests that the self is not a thing but a process, not an entity but an activity, the activity of presenting, of performing, of managing the impression that others form. And this management is constant, is exhausting, is the hidden labour that underlies all social interaction. The work of monitoring how one is being received, adjusting tone and posture and expression to match the demands of the situation, suppressing impulses that would be inappropriate, amplifying qualities that are valued. And this work is largely unconscious, is automatic, is the result of years of training in how to be a person, how to perform the role that culture assigns. And the training begins in childhood, begins with the learning of language, of gesture, of the countless small behaviours that signal, membership that indicate understanding of the rules, and children who fail to learn these behaviours, who cannot perform the expected roles, are marked as strange, as other, as outside the social order, and the marking is punishment, is exclusion, is the withdrawal of recognition, and recognition is what makes selfhood possible, is the confirmation that the performance is successful, that the presented identity is accepted, is real, and without recognition the self becomes unstable, becomes uncertain, becomes desperate for validation, for proof that it exists, and this desperation drives performance, drives the endless adjustment and refinement of presentation, drives the pursuit of authenticity that is really the pursuit of recognition, the desire to be seen, to be known, to be confirmed in one's existence by the gaze of another. And the gaze is selective, is interpretive, sees not what is actually there but what it expects to see, what it has been trained to see by culture, by category, by stereotype. And the person being gazed upon knows this, adjusts accordingly, performs the role that the gaze expects or deliberately subverts it, performs the opposite, performs resistance, but resistance is also performance. It is also a role, the role of the rebel, the nonconformist, the authentic individual who refuses to play the game. And this refusal is its own game, its own set of rules, its own performance that must be maintained. And the maintenance is exhausting, is perhaps more exhausting than conformity because it requires constant vigilance, constant assertion of difference, constant performance of not performing. And the paradox is that the more one tries to escape performance, the more theatrical the presentation becomes, the more calculated the spontaneity, the more rehearsed the authenticity. And there is no escape from this paradox, no way to be social without performing. Because sociality as performance is the presentation of self to others in forms that can be recognized, and recognition requires forms, requires categories, requires roles that are shared, that are understood, that carry meaning beyond the individual. And the individual is always exceeding these categories, is always more complex than any role can contain, is always feeling things that cannot be expressed, thinking things that cannot be said, experiencing a richness of inner life that the performance necessarily simplifies, necessarily reduces, and this reduction is the cost of being understood, the price of social existence. And the question is whether the price is worth paying, whether the recognition gained is worth the self that is lost. And the answer varies, is different for different people at different times, and some find the performance liberating, find relief in the structure, in the clarity of roles, in the ability to step into a character and leave the chaos of unmediated experience behind. And others find it suffocating, find the roles too constraining, the masks too heavy, the gap between inner and outer too painful. And these are the ones who talk about authenticity, who long for genuine connection, who want to be seen as they really are, but what they really are is not something that can be seen, is not something that can be presented, is only something that can be lived. And lived experience is private, is immediate, is lost in the translation to performance. And so the longing for authenticity is a longing for the impossible, for a form of recognition that would not require form, for a connection that would not require mediation, for a self that could be known without being performed. And this self does not exist, has never existed, is a fiction, is the romantic myth of the true self that lurks beneath the social surface, waiting to be discovered, to be liberated, to be expressed. But there is no beneath. There is no depth where the true self resides. There is only surface, only performance, only the endless presentation of forms that are more or less successful, more or less satisfying, more or less exhausting. And the exhaustion is real, is the inevitable result of constant performance, of the effort required to maintain coherence, to present a self that is consistent across contexts, that makes sense as a character, that can be narrated as a story. And the story is always being edited, always being revised, always adjusting to new information, to new audiences, to new demands. And the editing is not optional, is not something that can be refused without cost, because the cost is unintelligibility, is the failure to make sense, is the breakdown of social recognition. And without recognition, the self dissolves, becomes nothing, becomes the raw experiencing that has no form, no identity, no place in the social world. And the social world is the only world there is the only context in which selfhood is possible. And so the performance continues, must continue, is the condition of being human, of being a creature that exists not alone but among others, not in isolation but in relationship. And relationship requires presentation, requires the management of impressions, requires what Irving Goffman called dramaturgy, the theatrical metaphor for social life, the idea that all interaction is performance, that every encounter has a front stage where the performance happens and a backstage where the actor prepares. And the backstage is not more real than the front stage, is not where the true self resides, is simply where a different performance happens. The performance of relaxation, of letting down the guard, of being off duty. But this too is performed, is presented to those who are allowed backstage, who are granted access to the private self. And the private self is itself public in a different way, is itself a presentation designed for a specific audience, the audience of intimates, of those who are supposed to see the unguarded version. And the unguarded version is still guarded, is still shaped by expectations, by the desire to be seen in a particular way, by the need to maintain certain impressions, even in intimacy, especially in intimacy, because intimacy is where the stakes are highest, where the performance matters most, where failure to maintain character can destroy relationships, can shatter the trust that depends on consistency, on the beloved being who they claim to be, on the friend being recognizable, on the self being stable enough to be relied upon. And stability requires performance, requires the suppression of variability, the editing out of contradictions, the maintenance of a coherent narrative that makes the self intelligible as a character. And characters are not people, are simplifications, are abstractions, are the reduction of complexity to manageable form. And the management is necessary, is what makes interaction possible, but it comes at a cost, the cost of everything that does not fit the character, everything that contradicts the narrative, everything that would make the self less coherent, less consistent, less recognizable. And what does not fit is suppressed, is hidden, is relegated to the back regions of consciousness where it cannot disrupt the performance. And sometimes the suppression is so successful that the performer forgets what has been suppressed, loses access to the parts of experience that do not fit the role. And this forgetting is adaptive, is functional, is what allows the performance to be convincing, to be believed by others and by the self. But it creates a split, creates the sense that something is missing, that the performed self is incomplete, is not capturing everything. And this sense drives the search for authenticity, drives the belief that there is a true self waiting to be discovered, waiting to be expressed. But what is found when the search is pursued is not a true self, but more performances, more roles, more ways of presenting that feel more or less authentic depending on how well they are received, on how much recognition they generate, on how satisfying the performance is to the performer. And satisfaction is not a property of the role itself, but of the response it elicits, of the confirmation it receives, of the way it makes the social world respond. And the response is what matters, is what makes performance meaningful, is what converts the theatrical into the real. Because the real is not opposed to performance, but is produced by performance, is the effect of successful presentation, is what happens when the audience believes, when the role is inhabited so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from identity. And identity is not what the person is, but what the person is taken to be, what they are recognized as, what social position they occupy. And the occupation of position requires performance, requires the enactment of the behaviors associated with the position, and the behaviors must be performed correctly, or the position is lost. The identity is challenged, the self is thrown into crisis, and crisis is the breakdown of performance, is the moment when the role no longer works, when the script fails, when the audience refuses to play along. And these moments are revealing, are glimpses of the machinery behind the presentation, are proof that the self is constructed rather than discovered, is maintained rather than simply existing. And the maintenance is work, is constant work, is the hidden labour that everyone performs, but no one acknowledges, because acknowledging it would break the illusion, would make it impossible to believe in the roles, and belief is necessary, is what makes the performance effective, what makes social life possible. And so the work is hidden, is naturalised, is treated as if it were not work at all, but simply being oneself. And being oneself is the most demanding performance of all, is the role that requires the greatest consistency, the most careful management, the most exhaustive monitoring, because the self is the character that must be maintained across all contexts. That must make sense as a continuous identity, despite the fact that it is constantly shifting, constantly adapting, constantly being performed differently for different audiences. And the audiences do not see the shifts, do not notice the code switching, the way the person becomes different when they move from one social context to another, the way they adjust accent and vocabulary and posture and attitude to match the expectations of each situation. And this adjustment is automatic, is unconscious, is learned so thoroughly that it feels natural. But it is performance, is the work of fitting in, of being appropriate, of presenting a self that will be accepted, and acceptance is survival, is the condition of social existence. And those who cannot perform, who cannot adjust, who cannot present themselves in forms that others recognize and value, are excluded, are marginalized, are marked as failures, as problems, as people who cannot be understood. And understanding is recognition, is the confirmation that the performance has been received, has been interpreted correctly, has produced the intended effect, and the intended effect is always social, is always about positioning the self in relation to others, about claiming status, about asserting value, about demonstrating competence or vulnerability or power or need, depending on what the situation demands. And the demands are relentless, are changing, are requiring constant recalibration, constant adjustment of the performance to match new circumstances, new audiences, new expectations, and the exhaustion of this is cumulative, is building over time, is the reason why people speak of being tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of maintaining the masks, and the desire to drop the masks is the desire to stop working, to stop performing, to simply be without the labour of presentation. But being without presentation is not possible, is not a coherent idea, because being is always for someone, is always in relation, is always already a presentation. Even when it feels like pure existence, and the feeling of pure existence is itself a performance, is the role of the authentic person who has transcended roles. And this transcendence is another role, is perhaps the most demanding role because it must be performed without seeming to be performed, must appear effortless while requiring tremendous effort, must seem natural while being highly artificial, and the artifice is what makes it work, is what makes authenticity convincing, is what allows the performance to succeed. And success is measured not by internal states, but by external validation, by the response of others, by whether the performance is believed, and belief is what converts performance into reality, is what makes the presented self into the real self, is what allows people to say, "This is who I am," and mean it, even though who they are is what they're performing, is what they have learned to present, is what has been confirmed through recognition, and the confirmation is never final, is always provisional, is always requiring renewal, requiring continued performance, requiring the maintenance of character across time. And time reveals the instability of identity, reveals that the self is not fixed but fluid, not stable but shifting, not essential but contingent, contingent on circumstances, on audiences, on the roles that are available, on the scripts that can be enacted. And when the scripts fail, when the roles become unavailable, when the audience changes, the self changes with it, becomes someone else, performs a different character, and this transformation can be smooth or traumatic depending on how much is invested in the previous identity, on how deeply the role has been internalized, on whether the person believes they are the role or knows they are performing it. And knowing does not make the performance less real, but it does make it less rigid, makes it possible to change without crisis, to adopt new roles without losing the sense of continuity. And continuity is the narrative thread that connects performances, that makes the self coherent across transformations, that allows someone to say, "I have changed, but I am still me." And the still me is the story, is the interpretation that makes the changes make sense, that integrates them into a single life, a single identity, and the integration is retrospective, is always looking back and reinterpreting the past in light of the present. Making the past make sense as preparation for who one is now, and who one is now is who one is performing now, is the current role, the current presentation, and this will change, will be different in a year, in a decade, will be looked back upon as another version, another performance in the long series of performances that constitute a life. And the life is not the sum of these performances, but the narrative that connects them, the story that makes them cohere. And the story is itself a performance, is the presentation of a life as meaningful, as directed, as having purpose and continuity, when really it is just one thing after another, just a series of moments that are connected by memory and interpretation, not by any underlying essence, not by any true self that persists through change. And the absence of essence is not a problem, is not a lack, is simply the human condition, is what it means to be a creature that exists socially, that depends on recognition, that has no identity outside of performance, outside of the presentations that are received and confirmed and converted into reality through the collective agreement that this performance counts, that this role is real, that this person is who they claim to be. And the claim is always a performance, is always a presentation that could be otherwise, that could be challenged, that could be refused, and the refusal would unmake the identity, would leave the person without form, without recognition, without a place in the social order. And this is the terror that keeps performance going, that makes authenticity impossible and necessary at the same time, that ensures the exhaustion will continue, the masks will be maintained, the roles will be performed, because the alternative is not freedom but dissolution, not authenticity but unintelligibility, not the true self but no self at all. And no self is what humans cannot tolerate, cannot survive, cannot be. And so they perform, must perform, will always perform. And the performance is not false, but is what makes truth possible, is what makes identity possible, is what makes the social world possible. And the social world is the only world where selves exist, where persons are real, where the question of who someone is can be answered, and the answer is always a performance, is always a presentation, is always theatre, and the theatre is not opposed to reality, but is where reality happens, is where selves are made and unmade and remade, is where the human drama unfolds. And the drama is not pretense, but is the substance of social existence, is what people are when they are together, is what life looks like from the outside, from the position of the audience that is also performing, that is also presenting, that is also caught in the same machinery of recognition and validation and exhaustion. And the exhaustion is shared, is universal, is the common condition of beings who must perform to exist, who must present to be recognized, who must work to be real, and the work never ends, never arrives at completion, never achieves the authenticity it seeks, because authenticity is not a destination, but another performance, another role in the endless repertoire of human self-presentation. And the repertoire is all there is what the self is made of, is the material from which identity is constructed, and the construction is ongoing, is never finished, is always being revised and updated and performed anew. And the performance is life, is what it means to be human, is the condition that cannot be escaped or transcended, but only inhabited, only enacted, only performed with more or less grace, more or less awareness, more or less exhaustion. And the exhaustion is the price, is what is paid for social existence, for recognition, for the privilege of having an identity at all. And the price is worth paying because the alternative is unthinkable, is the void where no performance reaches, where no audience sees, where no self exists because there is no one to confirm it, no one to recognize it, no one to make it real. And real is what performance does, is the achievement of successful presentation, is the magic of theatre that converts pretense into truth, converts acting into being, converts the performed self into the only self there is. And there is no other, never was, never will be, only the masks and the wearing of them and the exhaustion of maintaining them, and the belief, necessary and false and true all at once, that somewhere beneath the performance there is something real, something authentic, something that is not performing. And this belief keeps the performance going, keeps the search alive, keeps people presenting and adjusting and performing and exhausting themselves in the endless work of being someone, of being anyone at all. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain, And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so, the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning. And the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance. And the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations, new forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance. And the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward. Because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization, and the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function, and so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity. And the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics, that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now.